Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Tuesday, November 23rd. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The game against Michigan is in 4 days. In the intro to yesterday's show, I mentioned the history of Ohio State and Michigan meeting as top 5 teams. The Wolverines are 6th in both national polls at the moment, but will likely be 5th in the college football playoff rankings when those come out later on tonight. But when I was looking that history up, I was just Googling and found an article titled The Game Ranking Every Top 5 Showdown Between Ohio State and Michigan from a few years ago about those 11 games. And then I noticed the byline, and it was from my old friend Bill Bender. And I figured, boy, this is a great excuse to have him on again. So, Bill, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Tom. Appreciate it.
So, assuming Michigan ends up in the top 5 of the CFP rankings later tonight, this would be just now the 12th game where both teams were in the top 5, which, that's a ton when you think about it. Just for comparison's sakes, there have only been, as far as I can tell, 2 Iron Bowls where both teams were top 5. So that, I think to me, that kind of underscores what a huge game this is.
No, for sure. And I know it's not technical. I was kind of hoping that Michigan would bump Notre Dame in the top 5 in the AP poll, so we had this as a technicality. But yeah, I mean, when it only comes around 11 times, and if you look at those 11 games, I think one of the most unique things about this rivalry is you and I can just say the year, and we were doing it off the air. You're like 1969, 1973. I've been fortunate enough to be alive for 4 of these top 5 showdowns. And in my opinion, Saturday basically counts anyway, because Michigan will probably be 5 in the CFP, like you said. And whether it was 1997, 03, 06, or 2011, those are kind of the games, or 2016, I'm sorry. Those are games that you and I know exactly where we were, exactly what we were doing, exactly what happened, who was the big player. I mean, I was on the edge of my seat in 16. It was such an incredible game. I think I've told that story to so many people about what it was like to cover that game, and it'll be nice to see it again.
Yeah, I'm going to let you tell that story about the 2016 game again in just a minute, but I did want to start with the top game on your list. It is probably, if you asked everyone to rank, everyone listening to this to rank those 11 games, I'm guessing this would be number 1 for just about everyone. Ohio State, Michigan, 2006, number 1, number 2, between the build-up and then the death of Bo Schembechler the day before the game. I mean, I don't think we are ever going to see anything like that again.
No, and it's not just because they were both undefeated and 11-0. I remember the build-up the most, and I think that build-up started in September. Michigan beat Notre Dame in a game where you were like, okay, they're for real. And then Ohio State was still marching on, had a wonderful class with Troy Smith, Ted Ginn, and those guys, and you knew they were going to be good. I think they beat Texas early in that season. It was the follow-up. They went down to Austin and won pretty convincingly. And I think by the time you got to November, everybody was feeling it. And you, at least in my lifetime, you'd never had that 1 versus 2 matchup, the undefeated matchup. Somebody or something always gets in the way. And I don't think anything can top the backdrop for that game with Bo dying. I'll tell you this story. I was in Las Vegas with my wife, and we went out and watched that game, and the amount of people wearing Michigan and Ohio State things and how loud those sports books were. And I believe Michigan covered on the late touchdown, but, some people were probably happy about that. But certainly the Buckeyes, that was a landmark victory, really the game that defines this entire rivalry in a lot of ways, at least from the Ohio State side.
The really interesting thing to me about that was there was a real push after that game for the national championship game to just be a rematch of Ohio State and Michigan. Because at the time it was like, well, this is number 1 and number 2. And they just played this classic game. And, to me, there's this like fascinating alternate history that plays out if that happens. Because I mean, a few years later, you saw that with Alabama and LSU, and they got to replay their game. If they did that in 2006, either Lloyd Carr or Jim Tressel gets another national championship. Urban Meyer does not get his first national championship. And really the whole narrative around the Big Ten and the SEC are probably completely different for years after that. Because that one game and the fact that Michigan got smoked in the Rose Bowl that same year by USC, that really changed the narrative around the Big Ten, and not in a good way. If those 2 teams play again, no matter who wins, it's like, boy, wow, the Big Ten, look at that. That changes a lot of stuff.
Oh, I mean, for Michigan, the entire program in some ways, because they turn around, they lose to USC, like you said. The next season, it begins with the Appalachian State loss, and everything's been, I don't want to say downhill since, but it was downhill for a very significant time. 2 coaching changes before they get to Harbaugh. I think that program now is in a place that is very comparable to the Lloyd Carr era in some ways because they're good. They're good this year. Are they good enough to finally beat the Buckeyes? I don't know. And then, like you said, I think it's a great point. Ohio State comes off that game, loses to Florida, loses to LSU the next year. The SEC takes off and really hasn't stopped. And that whole narrative has continued. And for Ohio State, they end up getting Urban Meyer a few years later and building this machine that I do this argument all the time. Ohio State, in my opinion, is basically an SEC school. The way they recruit, the talent that they have, they match up. We're not going to spin forward, but yeah, they've got the talent that matches up with Alabama and Georgia. They just don't win those games all the time. But it's not to say they couldn't compete with those two schools this year at all.
Yeah, and the talent this year is probably significantly better than the talent in the mid to late Tressel era, I would say for sure. Number 2 on your list was the classic 10-10 tie from 1973. Now that's you see the start of that game in the montage they play on Fox or whatever every year before the game, because that is the game where Ohio State players tore down that M Club banner before the game. Then afterwards, the Big Ten had to hold a vote to decide which of those teams would go to the Rose Bowl. Tell people about that game.
I think the best thing the Big Ten Network has produced is the Tiebreaker documentary on that game. And if any of your listeners haven't watched that, you should. It is amazing to see Archie Griffin and Hicks and Dennis Franklin and the Michigan guys and Gradisher, and they're all sitting in the same room talking about everything about that game. And it was the height of the 10-year war. It was an amazing game. It's a game that, Michigan felt like they've won, despite missing the 2 field goals. But you were going up against a Woody machine with Archie Griffin and all those things. And it is amazing to watch that those players still cared about that. And I think the funniest story out of that was, years later, one of the Michigan guys is telling a story about how Bo Schembechler said they needed to beat Purdue because they voted against them. And this was like 10 years later. So it is one of those games that sticks out to me because it's just so in the lore. And like I said, I wasn't even alive in 1973. And you almost know every detail about that game because it's been passed down to you.
Oh, yeah. I can tell you Dennis Franklin broke his collarbone, and that was one of the big deciding factors in Michigan not going. And Ohio State ended up validating that with, I think, their biggest Rose Bowl win ever. They just absolutely stomped on what was not a particularly good USC team that year. You mentioned the 10-year war. I mean, from 73 to 77, the game was a top 5 game 4 times in the span of 5 years, which is nuts. I mean, that's basically like Florida State in the 90s, essentially. But there have been top 5 games every decade since World War II, except for the 50s and 80s, which is pretty impressive that they've, both these teams have been so good consistently over such a long span of time. The last time it happened, before potentially this week anyway, was 2016. I'm sure everyone remembers that one. I'm sure everyone has their own story of what they were doing during that one. But, what was your biggest memory from that one?
I was in the press box, so I'm on the side where Ohio State's going in double overtime. Like, I'm probably around the 40-yard line where I'm sitting, and you know where I'm sitting. We sit next to each other all the time there. So it's when I saw the play unfold, the initial reaction was, man, he might be a little short. But when they called it a first down, I said, there's no way they're reversing that call. And I think the other thing that sticks out is Michigan. This is probably the last time that I actually thought, one, they had a chance to win the game. B, in the first half, they played like a team that was going to win the game. I thought when Wilton Speight scored in the first half, that was kind of like, okay, they're going to maybe do this. But there were so many things that happened, from Baker's interception to the way Michigan kind of, turtled up a little bit in the second half to let Ohio State back in, and everything that happened after. I went to the Michigan press conference. I think I caught Harbaugh the question before he did this, this much. And so I'm glad I didn't get yelled at in that press conference. But what a wonderful game. And really, this year is the first time since where, and I still don't, we can get into it in a minute, but I haven't felt like Michigan's had a chance in this game since. And maybe this year it's a little bit different. But even in 2018, I didn't really think Michigan was going to win this game.
Yeah, that was a whole different one. And that was not a top 5 matchup because Ohio State was not particularly great coming into that game. one last one that you had further down the list, which I wanted to touch on just because I think people might be a little bit surprised to figure out that it was a top five game, was 1968. Now that was, I mean, I say 1968 and everyone goes, okay, 50-14. And, that's because I couldn't go for three game. And everyone knows that. The context there is Michigan was ranked fourth coming in. And then Bump Elliott is out right after that game. So you go from the coach of a number 4 team to you're out after that, which is, that's crazy enough that it seems like something would happen now and not 50 years ago.
Oh, I mean, yeah. And as you know, I'm a Lancaster guy, and Rex Kern was the quarterback in that game. And he's a Lancaster legend, an Ohio State legend. And hearing him tell stories about that game, it's great. I mean, there's different accounts of Woody and how he said I didn't go for three, depending on who you ask, and you get really into that, or whether they did really mean to go for two. But it really did change the course of the rivalry because it was probably a low point for Michigan at the time. It results in Bo Schembechler getting hired. The 69 upset happens the following year. It launches the 10-year war. And really, I don't want to disrespect anything before 1969 because I realize that this rivalry has been forever. But I think it launched the 69 game, the 68 game combined, launched this rivalry into a different time zone. I mean, it really did. And everything after that, I mean, you're looking at 50 years of history. And like I said, I always tell people, you can say 2005 and somebody says Anthony Gonzalez. You say 2003, somebody says Chris Perry. It's literally its own like dialect between Ohio State and Michigan fans. It's crazy. And I think that's why, and I work with an Alabama grad and I've had an Auburn grad as an editor. And they get mad when I say there's really no comparison. There's just not any comparison to the history. It's kind of like, you've heard this before, but it's like an Arthurian legend type deal, this rivalry, and people follow it as such.
That 68 game is one of my favorites. I obviously have no memory of it. It was 10 years before I was born, but I think people assume when they hear went for two at the end, he ended with 50 points. It's like, they must have had 48 and then he went for two to get to 50. They actually missed the conversion, the 2-point conversion, or they would have ended up at 52.
Right.
It was, I went back and did a big research project on this whole thing and did what he actually say went for three a couple of years ago. And he said, I went back and read all the contemporaneous newspaper reports that I could find. And what he said at the time, it was because their long snapper was hurt. So they didn't have someone to long snap. So therefore they went for two. He actually went for two against Michigan in 1961 as well. That was one where it was going 48 to 50. I couldn't find any reference to the go for three quote in any of the newspaper reports of the day. There was, however, a great quote from a Michigan assistant coach named Tony Mason. The exact quote was, quote, "That fat hog went for two. That's why he's not wanted in this profession." It's like, man, that would have set Twitter on fire if Twitter was around in 1968. They should sell T-shirts with that quote in Ann Arbor. But that's plenty of talk about the past. Let's talk about the future. Give us a prediction on how this plays out on Saturday. How do you think this game plays out?
Well, the preliminary things to look at, and there's no secrets here. It's from the Michigan end. And I was texting some friends today asking this question: how do you cover all three of those receivers? How do you cover Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, Jackson Smith-Jigba, and what he's been able to do? CJ Stroud, obviously, it was a 7-on-7 clinic Saturday against the Spartans. You can't do that on air sometimes. And I know that's such a cliche, but they were that sharp in the passing game. And, Michigan is an interesting challenge because they do have two guys with 10 sacks in Hutchinson and Ajabo, and that will challenge the tackles. But if Ohio State blocks those guys, it's going to be tough to cover. On the other end, Michigan has to run the ball. They have to really look at that Oregon game, Phil. That's what is different to me is Michigan's going to try to run between the tackles. Ohio State's defensive line's figured it out. So can they attack the perimeter at all with Haskins? Will Corum play? And is Cade McNamara a guy that can turn it loose in this game? And it's a lot of ifs for Michigan to win. And I think for Ohio State, it's just staying within what they've been able to capture the last 3 to 4 weeks. Could be a very similar game to Penn State in a lot of ways, because I think Michigan is a slightly better offense than Penn State, but I don't know that the defenses are that different.
Yeah, that's had Bill Greed on yesterday's show, and he was like, "Here's the two things Ohio State needs to do to win." And there's the list is a little longer for stuff that Michigan's going to have go right in order to win. But as you said, like it's a conversation this year. Like this is going to be this should be a fantastic game. I was just thinking back, and I don't know if I actually introduced who you are. I said I think called you our old friend Bill Bender. Our old friend Bill Bender writes for the Sporting News. It is a publication you may have heard of. He is their national college football writer, and he also this week wrote a fantastic piece on a gentleman who has been in the news over the last couple of days. His name is LeBron James. He plays a little basketball, but he used to play high school football in the state of Ohio. And Bill told the story of his final catch as a high school football player. It was a fantastic story, really great, and played out involving a high school football team from like 5 miles away from my house. So, Bill, let people know about that story.
Yeah, I mean, 20 years ago, LeBron played high school football. Everybody knows he played, but few people, and a lot of people actually around here know that his final high school game was against Licking Valley, school down in Hanover. I covered Licking Valley as a sports editor in Newark for a few years. It was one of those, I always tell people it's like one of those varsity blues towns where football's everything. Their coach has been there forever. Their players amazing, and just told the story of the final game. And when you watch the game film, which I was fortunate enough to get, it's just wild watching a 6'6", 6'7" LeBron James up against a 5'8" cornerback, and the way that Licking Valley was able to defend him. The weather was bad. And again, it's kind of like all these Ohio State, Michigan stories in Ohio, and particularly living in Pickerington, being from Lancaster, we all have that high school football story. And this is one of those, the ones that I hear the most, honestly, from some of the guys that have been doing it for a long time. I'm like, here's the short list of guys I always hear about. And one's Andy Katzenmoyer, who was about my age. And I always hear stories about him at Westerville South. Two's Ben Roethlisberger, who's still playing, and him playing up in that corner in Findlay. And then three's LeBron, the people that went against him, mainly in basketball, obviously, but just talking to people about his football ability and what it was like to cover him. It was a lot of fun to put together. So if your listeners get a chance to click on that, yeah, he didn't elbow anybody in the face to my knowledge, but it's a fun story to read.
Yeah, that was a great read. I will throw a link to that in the post on for this podcast on the front page of BuckeyeScoop.com. Bill, let people know where they can find you on Twitter and where they can find your work.
Yeah, I'm at BillBender92 on Twitter, and you can find me at sportingnews.com. It's been good to catch up with you. I know we're all excited. This season is just blown by. It's getting into the holidays now. This is that stretch run. I don't know if I give you a prediction. I did put Ohio State 30. I think it was 38-26. Because my inclination when the line came out, I swore I was like, that line's going to be 12, 11 and a half. It should be. And it's starting to creep up a little bit. Might be around 10 by game time. So you might want to get it now for those people that are into that kind of thing.
Yeah, I have been kind of scratching things out, and I'm sort of in that 38-24 kind of range. So I think we're pretty much in line there. So Bill, thank you for joining me.
Oh, no problem. Thank you, Tom.
And we'll have a link to the ranking of those previous 11 top 5 games, as well as a link to that LeBron James story in the post for this podcast on the front page of BuckeyeScoop.com. You can also get great coverage there. Our team has been working a crazy week already. Bill Green had another fantastic piece. I may have to try and get him on a little later on this week to talk about his breakdown of the Ohio State offense that he posted on the Ask the Insiders board on Monday. That was fantastic. Mark Gifler had a fantastic update on just sort of where things stand with a number of Ohio State's top recruits in this class. That's all at BuckeyeScoop.com. We will have our live college football playoff ranking show tonight at 7:00. That's on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/BuckeyeScoop. Join Kevin Noon, Tony Gerdeman, and I there, youtube.com/BuckeyeScoop at 7:00. We'll do the usual watch the rankings, give you kind of our instant reactions and our look at what this all means for Ohio State moving forward. Should be good news for Ohio State, I would guess, tonight. But we will find out together at 7:00 at youtube.com/BuckeyeScoop. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.